Welcome, everyone. I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Public Programs Director at the American Civil War Museum. And I've got a few programs to make you aware of. This coming Monday, we'll have a history happy hour. These are in-person programs, and they take place in Richmond at various dining establishments about town. So Monday's History Happy Hour that will take place on November 14th at 6:30 will be at Bottoms Up Pizza. And we'll have with us historian and researcher Bibb Edwards talking about a Black family's incredible story of violence, resistance, and resilience in the early days of Reconstruction. And this is a fascinating story that Bibb and fellow researcher Ann Cross have uncovered. So they'll be unpacking this story on Monday night. So come out, join us, and have some good pizza. Then our December virtual book talk will take place on December 1st, 6:30. That's a Thursday evening, as usual. And we'll have Matthew Borders and Joseph Stahl back with us again. They'll be talking on their book, The Union Faces of Fredericksburg, which is appropriate for a December book talk. So plan on joining us for that virtual program. I'll also mention save the date for our symposium that will be held in live in person in Richmond on February 18th. It's a day-long event, but we will be live streaming that as well. You can go to our website to register for the symposium. And this is actually one of the few online programs that we do charge for, but we hope you'll join us. It is we've got a great slate of speakers. And the topic this year is Civil War and Making America. This is the launch for a programmatic multi-year endeavor where we'll be unpacking the Civil War, exploring its causes, course, and consequences. So join us for that. You can find more details on our website. Now for tonight, I am very pleased to introduce our guest author, Steve Cowie. He earned a degree from California State University, Long Beach. And as part of the Los Angeles film industry, he penned spec screenplays and sold his award-winning short film to the Sundance Channel. A lifelong student of the Civil War, Cowie dedicated 15 years to exclusively researching the Battle of Antietam. And his book, When Hell Came to Sharpsburg, is his first book. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the screen over to our guest author and let you hear from him.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for that nice introduction. And I'd also like to thank all you wonderful people for taking the time to watch and listen tonight. I'll be discussing my new book, which investigates the Battle of Antietam and its impact on the community of Sharpsburg, Maryland. It's a passion project that took 15 years to research and another 3 years to write. And it's based on an abundance of different sources, including roughly about 250 civilian war claims and congressional cases that I located at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. These claims documents contain a ton of new information about civilians impacted by Antietam, and they shed light on the hardships suffered by roughly 150 families who lived within a 5-mile radius of the battlefield in 1862. For the structure of this presentation tonight, I'm going to take you all from the battle's prelude through the bloody fighting on September 17th, 1862, as well as the gory aftermath of battle. And we will also examine General McClellan's 6-week encampment after the battle with his Army of the Potomac. And during that time, his federal soldiers took a devastating amount of civilian property and spread deadly diseases as well. And last, we'll follow the community through the frustrating decades-long claims process in which they pursued compensation from the U.S. government. And this process dragged into the 1900s. And it's important to note, I just like to point out that even though my focus tonight is on Sharpsburg, many of the civilian experiences that I'll describe tonight, they actually parallel the terrible hardships suffered by many other communities in the North and South during the American Civil War. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's dive into the content. For those who are not familiar with Sharpsburg, it's located in Western Maryland near the Potomac River and Antietam Creek. And what you're seeing here is just some images of some of the folks that lived here in 1862. I should have thrown that slide up a little earlier, but a map of Sharpsburg, again, to give you some perspective, it's located about 45 miles southwest of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And in 1860, Sharpsburg district had roughly 2,400 residents. It was a sparsely populated farming community, and it included 200 free persons of color and 150 slaves. Now, in September 1862, approaching the middle of the month, farmers and their hands were in the early stages of fall harvest. They were busily threshing wheat and oats and rye, and they were moving giant mountains, these huge stacks of timothy and clover hay, inside of their barns to store as winter feed. And they were also plowing their fields ready to seed their 1863 wheat crops and preparing to harvest hundreds and hundreds of acres of nearly ripe apples and potatoes and corn. So a lot of these farms, interestingly, when I look through the war claims and compared them to the 1860 agricultural schedules for Sharpsburg, many of these farms were very heavily stocked with livestock at the time of the battle. Wasn't uncommon for some of these farmers to own a dozen cattle and a couple dozen sheep, maybe 2 or 3 dozen hogs. But they also had just dozens and dozens of chickens. Some farmers had 200 to 300 chickens on their farms, as well as ducks and turkeys and geese and so forth. So all of these crops and animals that I've described, they were crucial to one's annual income. And they also provided food for families and livestock as well. And so in many ways, mid-September 1862 would have been the worst possible time for an interruption of farming, but then came Antietam. And to save time for this talk, I'm going to fast forward through the Maryland campaign of 1862, and I'm going to bring you all right up to September 15th, 1862, when the Confederate and Federal armies arrived in the Antietam Valley. There were roughly 120,000 soldiers from the combined armies smothering farms in the Sharpsburg area, as well as the nearby village of Keedysville. For 2 days, General George McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac for the United States, he made preparations to attack General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Now, during these 2 days of preparations, all was not quiet in the area because both sides exchanged artillery fire, and the cannonading on September 16th, the day before the main battle, this cannonading became incredibly violent, and it was followed in the late afternoon of the 16th by fairly heavy skirmishing that happened just north of the town of Sharpsburg. We need to take into account that Sharpsburg up until this time had not hosted Civil War combat. So the combined artillery fire and musketry scared the wits out of people and forced dozens of families to flee their homes in terror. And they scattered in all directions. Many of them evacuated along the Potomac River. There were lock houses operated by the C&O Canal. There were also some farmsteads adjoining the waterway. And there are also large caves along the Potomac River, which still exist to this day. And what we see on the screen here was one of those large formations located just west of the town of Sharpsburg, where anywhere from 100 to maybe 200 people, based on the accounts, huddled, in these caves, wondering what was going on and when they could go home. what happened was you had a lot of these people who were stuck there from September 15th, and they didn't return home until the early hours of September 19th. But not everyone fled to the river, because there were people in the town of Sharpsburg that took their chances, and they went down into the basements of the brick and the stone homes, hoping that those formidable walls of brick and stone would protect them from artillery shells. And it was a similar situation based on the accounts. One sworn deposition of a citizen in a war claims case stated that he was in his basement for those 3.5 days with 75 people. And that included old folks and some newborn babies, even dogs. People brought their pets down there. It was just a trying time because no one knew what was going to happen next. And what happened next was the Battle of Antietam. It erupted in the early hours of September 17th, and it unfolded in 3 savage phases of combat across farmsteads, farm fields, orchards, woodlots. This was ground where people lived, where they worked, where they worshiped. There were businesses on this field. There were 2 gristmill complexes and a church. And Antietam proved to be what still stands to this day as the single bloodiest day in American military history. In just 12 hours of fighting, there were roughly 23,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. So a lot of this carnage was caused by the 520 pieces of artillery reportedly engaged on September 17th. And this destructive fire killed countless soldiers and struck almost every building on the battlefield proper. In fact, all but one farmer listed in their war claims artillery-related damages to their homes and outbuildings and barns. Shot and shell destroyed a number of structures. The Dunker Church that you see here on the left of the slide took a number of hits, including a cannonball hole that was described by one soldier as so large that a man could walk through it. There was a farmhouse that burned to the ground. Many of you who have studied Antietam know of it. It was owned in 1862 by Samuel and Elizabeth Mumma. And during the fighting, Confederates intentionally set fire to this stately farmhouse, and artillery shells struck and destroyed by fire the Mumma's farm and their hog pen and spring house. But the image that you see on the right of your screen, that's an example of one of the many buildings that was damaged or destroyed that is outside the limits of the modern day park boundaries of Antietam. That barn sat right across from where the Antietam's Visitor Center now stands today. It was owned by Samuel and Sarusha Reel in 1862. The park rangers at Antietam estimate that there were roughly 50,000 rounds of artillery fire exchanged during the fighting on September 17th, and many of those rounds missed their marks. They sailed beyond the lines. They went east of Antietam Creek, and they went west of the Confederate line. And one example here of those overshot shells to the west is the town of Sharpsburg, which took a beating on September 16th and 17th. Where we're looking now is we're on the east side of town looking west. And this high ground where the camera's position is where Confederate batteries, this is the vicinity of where Confederate batteries were staged during the battle. And if we were to turn ourselves around and look in the opposite direction, we would have been looking right at Antietam Creek, where the Federal Reserve Artillery, where some of those guns were based. And they were firing long-range projectiles towards these Confederate targets, and hundreds of shells, based on the accounts, missed their mark and sailed into the town where we're looking. There were dozens of homes that caught fire. Many of them were destroyed. A lot of people don't know that, but there was quite a bit of destruction in the town. It included 2 barns that were in the middle of the village and 2 frame dwellings that were owned by 2 widows in 1862. And based on the research of the widows' real estate holdings, these were the only properties they owned. So the destruction of their dwellings rendered the ladies and their children homeless. But again, we'll get back to those people that were in their basements during this fighting. They were stuck there. They were trapped, and shells were pummeling the town. Some of them were crashing through the walls. Some of these structures caught fire. The citizens had to rush upstairs and try to extinguish the flames. It was absolutely terrifying for some of these people. And there was one young lady in 1862 in her parents' cellar. She later gave an interview in which she stated, in part, every time the firing began extra hard, the babies would cry and the dogs would bark. Occasionally, a woman was quite unnerved and hysterical, and some of those old-aged men would break out in prayer. Another way that Antietam impacted the community involved field hospitals. There were thousands of wounded during the battle, and because of this emergency, the medical staff in both armies commandeered nearly every property in the area for hospital purposes, using any buildings they could find to shelter these patients. And when residents returned from their evacuation sites, they found their homes so crowded with wounded and medical staff that they were forced to shelter elsewhere, sometimes for anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, until the hospital personnel no longer occupied those domains. There were some families that were allowed to stay in their homes, but they were consolidated with their children. Some of them had 7, 8 children back then. It wasn't uncommon for these families to have a lot of kids, and they were all quartered into 1 or 2 rooms. But this discomfort really pales in comparison to the true emergency that was at hand. And that was a supply crisis that the medical department of the Army of the Potomac faced. Due to this supply shortage, which was based on logistical problems that I can get into later, prevented the medical items from being forwarded to the Sharpsburg environs. And the medical staff, as a result, they didn't have what they needed on hand, especially for the first 4 to 8 days after the battle. As a result, they had no choice. They went into the civilians' homes and took anything they could use for the hospital purposes. They ripped apart the family's clothing and bedding and carpeting, window blinds for bandages. They carried off pots and pans and cookware and silverware for preparing food and serving food to the patients. What happened was, when these people, some of those that were staying home still, that still lived in their dwellings, they were watching their homes just get emptied, and there was nothing they could do about it. And you'd think some of these folks would have been irate, but in fact, based on the evidence, it tells us that the opposite was true. These people saw what was unfolding before their eyes. It was a horrible emergency, and the civilians pitched into the crisis to help. Whatever food they had left, they were baking bread, they were making soup. Some farmers willingly slaughtered their own livestock to serve as food in the hospitals. And there were other men in the community that were getting up at 4 a.m. and taking their wagons and 4-horse teams all the way to Hagerstown, which was 12 miles north of the battlefield, for the purpose of searching for hospital supplies, just to help out these desperate army surgeons. So this is just a slide showing an example of civilians volunteering at the hospitals. What these people witnessed there on the front lines was absolutely horrible. I go into a lot of that grisly detail in the book, and I won't try to make anyone upset at the stomach by giving those examples in this talk. So I'll just kind of skip past that. But they were on the front lines seeing these horrible wounds and suffering and death. Just terrible experiences, especially for the children who were present to see all this. But it's important to note that hospital staff, they were not the only ones entering civilians' homes during and after the battle, because straggling was a terrible problem at Antietam in both armies. Depredating soldiers from both sides ransacked countless homes, walking away with money, jewelry, Bibles, family photographs. It's just, the list goes on and on with these thefts. Describing some of the Confederate plundering, one townsman who lived in the town of Sharpsburg, he wrote in late September 1862, "They entered several poor people's houses and robbed them of everything they had in this world. 2/3 of the families in the place had nothing but the clothes on their backs." But war claims allege that Union soldiers also plundered many houses. And in fact, the federal depredations became so widespread that General McClellan issued General Order number 159 on October 1st, 1862, for the purpose of addressing the stragglers and pillagers lawlessly depredating upon the civilians. And these heavy losses from the stragglers and the medical personnel, they cast many residents into troubled circumstances. To give you one example, the wife of a tenant farmer, she testified later that after the Antietam battle, the Union troops came on the farm and took everything we had and ruined us. I know we lost all we had. So McClellan's general order brought many Union soldiers back into line. Excuse me while I take a drink. But the Army of the Potomac continued taking private property from the community, and here's why. In campaigns like Gettysburg in 1863 and Monocacy in 1864, the Army soon left the area after the fighting concluded, leaving their wounded and medical personnel behind, of course. But that wasn't the case at Antietam, because after the battle, McClellan's army, which I'll refer to hereafter as the AOP for the Army of the Potomac, these forces remained in the region for 6 weeks. And by early October, according to the OR, the official records, there were more than 75,000 men and officers present for duty just in the Sharpsburg area. And I'll give you an example on this map. What we're seeing here, if you all, just to kind of let you see, if you can see my mouse, I'm circling the town of Sharpsburg right here. And this area where my mouse is kind of going up and down would have been the Antietam battlefield, roughly. But you can see there were 4 corps staged here. 2 of those corps, the 1st Corps and 5th, they stayed here for the entire 6 weeks. Elements of the 6th Corps remain for that time as well. They were staged north of Sharpsburg in the vicinity of Bakersville, stretching all the way towards Williamsport. And the 9th Corps was south of Sharpsburg, near a business called Antietam Iron Works. There was one environmental study that compared this amount here on October 1st, the amount of men, the 75,000 at that time in this 5-mile radius just to Sharpsburg, would have outnumbered the populations of cities at that time like Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh and Detroit. But the problem is that those cities had supply systems for their large populations. And Sharpsburg, it was a remote farming community that did not even have a railroad depot or railroad near it in 1862. And what really made matters worse for McClellan and the Army of the Potomac is that Confederates earlier in the Maryland campaign of 1862 sabotaged part of the AOP's supply lines by burning the railroad bridge at Monocacy Junction. They also wrecked sections of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and burned 2 bridges at Harper's Ferry. And this seriously delayed supplies from being forwarded to the Sharpsburg area. I should mention too that for anyone who studied Antietam wondering where the rest of the army was, the 2nd and 12th Corps were sent shortly after the battle down to the Harper's Ferry area. That's why they don't appear on this map, but they needed to be supplied too. This problem disrupted supplies from being sent to all those soldiers. And it didn't affect just the medical department, as I was going into before. It also affected McClellan's commissary and quartermaster departments. And I'd like to give you an example of some of those commissary losses. As a result of the Army's food shortage, soldiers and Army butchers and hospital cooks, they took food based on these claims. Again, to remind folks, I had the luxury of reviewing 250 claims related to Antietam that were filed by the civilians. So I had an abundance of evidence here to work with. And there were countless families that claimed that they lost all of their food at this time. So, these military forces and medical forces were going into the homes, they were going into the smoke houses and the spring houses and just walking away with everything that they could use. It prompted a local newspaper to report just 2 weeks after the battle, what our people will do to obtain food for man and beasts during the approaching winter, God alone only knows. The soldiers, they stripped everything based on the allegations, from vegetable gardens to potato patches and apple orchards. They carried off flour and preserves. The list, kind of like the items in the household that I was describing, like clothing and bedding, it's just endless, the amount of food that was taken as well. And now I'll give you an example of livestock. According to a sample of war claims, for the 6 weeks that McClellan's army was in Sharpsburg, September 15th to late October 1862, the Army of the Potomac allegedly destroyed 1,600 head of cattle, sheep, and swine, and also butchered more than 3,000 chickens and turkeys and ducks and so forth. Based on the accounts, these soldiers asked no permission for any of this. They took as they wanted, and they paid the civilians nothing. And all this subsistence was used reportedly for the camps and hospitals in the Sharpsburg area, but no doubt some stragglers would have taken some of that food as well. Humans were not the only ones in need of food after the battle. McClellan's army on October 1st, based on the OR, had 18,000 horses and mules attached to the army, concentrated just near Sharpsburg in that map I just showed you. And all these animals needed copious amounts of daily forage to survive. Consequently, in a sample of war claims, again, I had to go through these things claim by claim and add everything up, but it was important to understand the comprehensive totals. And what I came up with is that the AOP's animals destroyed in those 6 weeks more than 4,000 tons of corn and wheat and rye and oats and so forth during that time. Describing such losses, one resident testified that all the products on his Sharpsburg farm disappeared like frost before a burning sun. And all these losses that I've described so far, they're just the tip of the iceberg. I could go on and on about this stuff. I'll give you a few examples. Soldiers from both armies took dozens of horses and mules from citizens, again, without offering permission or payment. They stripped farms and roadways of all types of fencing to use the rails as firewood. This left sections of Sharpsburg a vast and unrecognizable plain. They destroyed thousands of mature hardwood trees, incredibly, to also use as firewood, splitting apart the logs to use in their camps. But they also used that timber to build log shelters along the Potomac River, dozens and dozens of military huts to shelter themselves as the temperatures became quite cold through as late as October unfolded. These losses, again, they put families into financially catastrophic circumstances. For example, without horses, it was the transportation, it was the engine of farming as well. How were folks supposed to work their farms or haul their grains, what were left of them, to the market? And without fencing, which was extremely laborious and expensive to replace, how could farmers protect future crops from foraging wildlife or contain any new livestock that they might acquire? Without that fencing, all their new sheep and cattle and swine, it would just wander off. But in many regards, though, this was the least of their problems, because another way that Antietam impacted Sharpsburg, Antietam and its aftermath, involved deadly diseases. Hundreds of dead army horses. I'm sorry, here are some totals. It's probably better that I skip this slide because no one wants to read that amount of text anyways, right? So I'll just kind of skip past that one just to give you a summary of everything that they took. But in Antietam's aftermath, the ecological conditions were terrible. Like I mentioned, there were hundreds of dead army horses that rotted on the battlefield into late October for weeks. And there were piles of amputated limbs that just remained exposed in piles outside of the field hospitals. We have to consider the latrine sinks of human waste and feces from 75,000 soldiers and 4,000 tons of manure, it was estimated, from McClellan's army animals that polluted the ground in that area. All of this matter attracted swarms of houseflies, and it polluted the groundwater as well with harmful bacteria. And as a result, a disease outbreak erupted. Typhoid fever, diarrhea, and other diseases were reported in McClellan's camps and hospitals, and it raged from the camps and hospitals into the civilian population as well. And in my book, I go into a lot of detail about the disease outbreak. Much of it is based on the medical daybooks of Dr. A.A. Biggs. He was Sharpsburg's doctor before, during, and after the war. And his daybooks, he made house calls throughout the area. And he would log the dates from each day that he worked, as well as the patients that he saw and the medicines dispensed. And when you start examining some of these medicines, they do correlate with a lot of the diseases reported in Antietam's hospitals and camps. Typhoid fever was especially prevalent among Antietam's civilians. And by comparing Biggs's daybook data to the burial records, death records that I had available to me in Washington County, Maryland, there was there was a chilling spike that I was able to find that occurred. It basically lasted from late September 1862 and lasted all the way up until April 1863. But what we see roughly by November 1862 is that his patient base had quadrupled. And a lot of these burial records in those 6 months, they were quadruple the normal average of burials that we see in a lot of those local graveyards. The number of civilian deaths is impossible to quantify, but I can just give you one example of many. It involved the family of John C. Middlecoff. He was a farmer who lived just north of the Antietam battlefield. And in a span of 6 weeks, typhoid fever took the life of Middlecoff, his 3 adult daughters, and a granddaughter. Again, this tragedy is one of many examples that I reviewed. A local man summed up the outbreak in a letter that he wrote in late 1862. After describing the disease-related cases of his brother and granddaughters, Jacob Miller wrote, "Many other citizens and hundreds of soldiers have been taken with the same, and many died. It is an army disease, thus adds an addition to the horrors of war." And that brings us to the final phase of my research, which involves the war claims and congressional cases. This process consisted of 3 phases, 3 acts: the Act of July 4, 1864, the Bowman Act, and the Tucker Act. And all 3 of these acts were divided into 2 parts: merits, which involved the facts of a case, and loyalty, which investigated a claimant's political leanings during the war. And the process of claims, of pursuing claims for the Sharpsburg folks, it began with the Act of July 4, 1864, which was also known as the July 4th Act. It empowered Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs to dispatch special agents from his quartermaster department to the Sharpsburg area to investigate the claims and tour the affected properties and interview claimants and their witnesses. Now, there were a number of problems with this July 4th Act. For example, by the time that McClellan's army finally left Sharpsburg at the end of October 1862, there were many families teetering on economic ruin. They needed compensation to replace all these items that had been taken. But what I found was that the claims investigations for these people did not begin in earnest until the mid-1870s. And by that time, Congress had inserted a number of clauses into the July 4th Act, which further limited what petitioners could claim. And that included theft and depredations, hospital rent, anything, of course, related to the Confederate Army the United States government wasn't going to pay. And also, a big one for claimants is that you couldn't pursue anything related to combat. Combat-related damages were considered by the War Department as the ordinary ravages of war. One of the farms that I mentioned earlier, owned by Samuel and Elizabeth Muma, Confederates set fire to their house during the battle, and artillery fire destroyed the barn and 2 outbuildings. It wouldn't have mattered if Federals would have intentionally set fire to the house under the July 4th Act. This was all related to combat during the Battle of Antietam, and as a result, the Mumas were not allowed to claim a penny for the destruction of their farmstead. I could go on and on about the limitations of the Act of July 4, 1864. One of the big ones is that it did not allow claimants to cross-examine witnesses. So you may have presented all the favorable evidence that could have won your case in your eyes. 20 people in the community might have testified that you were a staunch Union patriot supporting the Federal Army. But all it took was one person in that neighborhood to whisper in the special agent's ear that you were disloyal, and that quartermaster agent could use that statement as a basis for torpedoing your entire claim. Even if you had 72 line items in there, he would take away all those based on the accusation that you were a Southern sympathizer during the war. As a petitioner, you could not counter that claim. You could not argue against it because you were not allowed to see the final report before it was sent to General Meigs in Washington. So as a result, I reviewed roughly 127 July 4th claims that I found for this project. I had a whole bunch of claims, but I was only able to find the outcomes for 127. No surprise, General Meigs rejected more than half of them, either for suspected disloyalty or for insufficient evidence. And of those remaining claims that Meigs approved, the petitioners only received on average roughly 15% of the total amount claimed. That's 15%. So understandably, people were outraged, and this didn't only apply to Sharpsburg. There were hundreds of petitioners in the northern and border states that felt cheated by the rules of the Act of July 4. And the outpouring of complaints forced state representatives to take action. And in response, Congress passed the Bowman Act in 1883 and the Tucker Act in 1887. Now, these acts shifted the jurisdiction of claims from the War Department over to the U.S. Court of Claims. And it took, instead of the quartermaster department investigating the cases, it was now the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney General, who sent assistant attorneys to Sharpsburg to interrogate the claimants and their witnesses. Now, these congressional acts, these latter two congressional acts, were a little more lenient, even though they came under attack by the slick and savvy attorneys of the U.S. government. The claimants fared a little better in 65 cases that I reviewed. Roughly, one half of them received settlements, and of those who were paid by the U.S. Treasury, those payments amounted to roughly one half of what they were seeking. So the outcome was far better than the Act of July 4. However, these cases dragged on into the 1900s. And in fact, the last cases that I investigated for this research project, they were settled in the year 1915, 53 years after the Battle of Antietam. And of course, by that time, a number of the claimants had passed away. And so their cases hinged on the memories of any surviving witnesses, who oftentimes included the spouses or children who might have witnessed the battle, who are now adults. Even former employees, even former slaves testified in some of these cases. And the assistant attorneys of the U.S., they attack the memories of these people, questioning how much they actually knew about the taking so many years earlier. And I like to close with a quote by one of those witnesses whose memories came under attack. At the time of the Battle of Antietam, Angeline Jackson was a 17-year-old domestic servant living and working on the farm of Captain David Smith, who lived just west of the town of Sharpsburg. Almost 40 years later, Angeline testified in Captain Smith's Tucker Act case, and she provided explicit details explaining and describing how the federal soldiers stripped Smith's farm bare after the battle. Her memory, based on these lengthy depositions that I read, it didn't appear to have faded at all. But as attorneys kept questioning her, and it almost seemed like they were doubting her memory when you read between the lines of these depositions, she stated something that I think is very important. She went off script to emphasize to these people that her memory had not faded. And she said something that I think represents many other civilians that lived in this neighborhood at the time of the battle. Angeline told the attorneys, "I remember all these things distinctly. It seems to have been burned into my mind, and I shall remember it as long as I can remember anything." And this concludes the presentation. I'd like to thank you all very much for taking the time to watch and listen. And before I throw this back to Kelly, I'd just like to briefly mention where you can buy the book if you're interested at all. It's available at Savis Beatty's website, savisbeatty.com, and you can also find it on Amazon. So thank you all once again. And I tried to make this somewhat of a brief conversation by design so that we could have some time for questions and answers if you have any. I'll be glad to take those now. So I'm going to try to click the stop share, and I hope this works. Let's see if this sends it back to Kelly.
That worked, and now I've unmuted myself, so that's good.
Excellent.
Thank you for that talk. There's so much excellent information. I'll also add that we have the book too. So if you want to buy it from the American Civil War Museum, go on to our website at acwm.org. We have recently updated the shop, so everything is new and hopefully easier to use. But lots of good places to get that book, and so much information. I was just overwhelmed by the amount of information in there, and I was trying to think about, okay, what kind of questions do I want to ask? But now, before I do that, I do see that somebody has just chimed in with a question, so I'm gonna I'm going to take some audience questions first before I jump in there. But Larry asked, how long did Meigs control these claims?
That's information that I used to have at the top of my memory, and I no longer have, unfortunately. So I apologize for not having that at the at my fingertips for you. But he appeared in every claim that I reviewed, and these lasted from, again, the cases that were investigated for Sharpsburg lasted from the mid 1870s until the early 1880s. So I don't know if that exactly matches the time that he was in charge of the quartermaster department, but that his name appeared throughout every claim, and I didn't come across any other. But that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that there wasn't another quartermaster general who took his place before the early 1880s. I could be mistaken with that.
All right, well, thank you for that. And then I noticed earlier that Kendall had a question, said stunning artwork of the battles being used, and wanting to know where that artwork came from. I believe that's in reference to some of the sketches that you
Yes. I could probably, if you want to, if anybody has any questions and they don't want to ask right now, I have, I'm not trying to, this isn't a promotional thing. It's just more informational, but I have a website. It's stephencowie.com. If you want to ask me any questions there, just shoot me an email through there and I'll be glad to answer it, because that is a sketch that I pulled from the Library of Congress, and I don't recall if he's referring to the actual sketch that I used for the battle. I do not remember the name of the artist who actually is responsible for that battle sketch, but I do know that there was Alfred Woad and Francis Schell, some of those others that I had used in this presentation.
I was going to say, I thought I noticed or recognized a couple of Woad sketches. Yeah. He's pretty recognizable, I feel like.
Yes.
And Donna says, your remarkable 18-year effort has tonight benefited all of us. Congratulations. And
thank you.
Let's see. I do have a question. Just in all of the research that you did, what was the most surprising thing that you came across?
That's a great question, Kelly. Honestly, there were so many phases. I mean, to give you all an example, I first researched the battle for a number of years, just the Battle of Antietam in the 1862 Maryland campaign, to get a feel just for what happened in this area militarily. And I probably spent 6-7 years just studying that. Driving, I live in East Tennessee, but I made numerous trips to Sharpsburg to hike alongside the Rangers on their guided tours, and I hired some guides to take me throughout the area, like Frederick and Harper's Ferry, South Mountain, and so forth. So I did that before I dove into civilians. But from there, I went into the genealogical aspect, and I studied the genealogies of these people for a number of years: census data, last will and testaments, tons of land records. So this was all great up until I got to the National Archives phase. That's when it really blew my mind, because I was just hoping to maybe find about 20 claims. And I should mention too, if I hadn't done the genealogical research first and put it all in the spreadsheet, I had about 360 heads of households that I was studying at that phase. And when I took that to the National Archives, I was able to use that in the dockets to look up a whole bunch of civilian names, because by that time I knew I had a really good feeling, and I was able to actually determine who lived in the area in September 1862 and where those residences were located. So when I got to the National Archives, I was hoping to find maybe 20 claims. And what I found was roughly 250. And to answer your question, that's where it really kind of rocked me, so to speak, because I didn't realize how many people had been impacted by Antietam. I didn't realize how long that McClellan's, how far this rippled, so to speak, not just into McClellan's encampment, but it rippled physically within a 5-mile radius of Sharpsburg. When I was going into this, I'd just kind of been almost programmed to see it as like the Antietam national battlefield boundaries, and these were the people who were impacted most. But what I found is you have to actually remove those boundaries for this research project to really get a feel for how all these people suffered, especially the people in town. Good grief, the number of buildings destroyed and all their property was taken too. So Antietam, we know it is the deadliest day in American history, but what I walked away from afterwards is that it was actually a far more horribly impactful battle than what I had previously believed. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think it does. And I guess as you were giving the talk tonight, that's one thing that I was struck by, because I haven't, you know that there's an impact on the civilians, but to that extent, I wasn't fully aware of that. Someone has asked about, let's see, I noticed on the slide of the doctor's drug dispenser the name of Muma. How many families even survived to make claims? Not quite sure what the thrust of that.
Yeah. Well, there's two parts. If you're referring to it as the first part that I think of is kind of going into the reason why these claims stretch so long because of all the different congressional cases. Well, a lot of these farmers died before their settlements came, but their families, their executors, their administrators continued the claims process on their behalf to try to pursue compensation for the estate. Now, if that question pertains to the disease outbreak, again, I can't really quantify how many people died as a result of those diseases. But again, if a farmer was taken out, and they were, there were a number of those claimants that died during the disease outbreak, but their spouses or their adult children carried on their cases on their behalf. That didn't always help, though, when it came time to actually, trying to give your testimonies to the investigating agents or the attorneys, because the actual petitioner wasn't there to give a statement. They had already died. So that really put them, in a bad spot, so to speak. And, some of these adult children might not have had the same knowledge of what had happened on that farm as their father did, so to speak.
And kind of switching focus a little bit, Stephen asked, what happened to the Confederate wounded and prisoners?
Yes. Well, what happened after Antietam in a nutshell is that, for the first several days, all those patients were actually, for up until the 18th, there were a number of patients that from both armies that were all consolidated in this area. But when Lee's army withdrew from Sharpsburg on the evening of September 18th, there were thousands of wounded who could either be moved by ambulance or were able to limp or walk. A lot of those wounded, actually thousands of them, we don't know how many, but they left with Lee's army and crossed the Potomac River into what is now West Virginia. It was Virginia back then. A lot of them went into the town of Shepherdstown. Again, this was a Confederate state then, so they kind of checked themselves into local hospitals there and a lot of the churches and homes and towns there. But there were anywhere from maybe 2,000 to 4,000 Confederates, it's a rough guess, that remained in Sharpsburg in the battle's aftermath. And they were consolidated onto farms mostly west of the town of Sharpsburg, but there were some field hospitals that were near the East Woods that were mixed. They were mixed with Federal and Confederate wounded. Quite a few of them, in fact. And there was a church in the town of Sharpsburg that was dedicated just to Confederate wounded as well.
And back to civilians, did the Sharpsburg civilians get fully compensated, or were they shorted? I think you may have touched on that a little bit. And could they file an appeal?
Yes, well, that's kind of how these acts all unfolded chronologically. And if you were, let's say, for example, that you put in a claim for the Act of July 4, 1864, and the War Department came back with a award of maybe $5 out of your $600 that you were claiming. And that was not uncommon to see a settlement like that. You had two choices. You could either accept that payment as the final settlement from the United States government, forever dropping charges for your remaining balance, or you could decline the charges and take your chances on prosecuting that claim if the government passed another act. They didn't know at that time if they would. And that's exactly what happened. Like with the Bowman Act of 1883, it considered claims that had been entirely rejected. Only if your claim was entirely rejected could you refile those losses. Because again, if you had already received a partial payment for them, you were barred by the limitations of that act. So that kind of is what the process was insofar as appeals, if it makes sense. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And Donna mentions anyone who has not been to Antietam in December, there is an annual illumination of the battlefield with one candle for each death of those 3 days. Have you
Yes.
been to that illumination?
I've never been to Sharpsburg in the winter months. I take that back. I went one time in February, but I really want to see that. I mean, the photos and videos I've seen, I encourage anybody who is able to see it in person to go. But if just for the sake of giving you goosebumps, look at some of the images online, because everything that I've heard from people that have done it, it's just, you're seeing one candle for every casualty. And it's just it's something that'll give pause for sure. It's very sobering.
And somber too, I'm sure. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been there either. I've been to Antietam, but not for the illumination. And I think is one of my favorite battlefields that I've visited. So you talked a little bit about your process and how you started with the battle itself and looking at the military aspect of it. What was it that drew you to the Battle of Antietam specifically?
Oh, yeah, I don't want to go too far into that, but I'd been a Civil War nerd, so to speak, since I was a little boy. My father he taught social studies in middle school when I was growing up, and he brought a lot of these stories to the dinner table. So it may sound like I'm making this story up, but I'm not. When I was maybe in 4th or 5th grade, I actually had written letters to the Gettysburg battlefield based on an article that had run in the newspaper at that time of a possible development of some sort of shopping mall or something on the battlefield proper. So as a kid, I don't know what propelled me, but I was concerned. I remember feeling very concerned. I wrote them and they wrote me back to assure me that would not happen. So, but that's just one example of many how I was into this. But I had really gotten into Antietam with all my reading and everything. But I grew up I moved from Michigan as a child to the West Coast, California. And that made it kind of difficult to see these wonderful battlefields on the East Coast for sure. But I had really taken an interest to Antietam in my 20s and 30s. And it wasn't until I moved to Tennessee years later that I thought, look at all this access I have to all this great history. And it may surprise some of you that here I was based in Tennessee. You'd think I would have picked Chickamauga or Shiloh. That wasn't the case. I went straight to Sharpsburg for my first visit, and it grabbed a hold of me, and I didn't look back. I knew at that point that I really wanted to write something about it. So granted, no offense to all the other wonderful battlefields here. Now that I've finished this 18-year project, I finally have time to visit them, and it'll be wonderful.
That's excellent. And John has typed into the chat that Montgomery Meigs retired from the Army in February of 1882. So that makes
excellent
sense. What you were saying about all those claims going into the 1880s.
Thank you for looking that up. That's fantastic. Yes, I need to remember that for future talks, so I have it right up here.
And let's see, I think another question just came in. In your research, did you run across any information about the impact of Confederate disease on the environment resulting from eating unripe food while around Sharpsburg?
I actually found something a little more to the contrary, believe it or not, is that some of the civilian letters, interestingly, they referred to these are, again, civilian letters that I had access to from the 1850s all the way to the 1860s. But some of these Sharpsburg farmers, they made reference to actually enjoying eating their roasting ears when they were green, when they were not ripe yet, because the corn that they grew back then, at least in Sharpsburg, it was known as Indian corn, or what some people might refer to as dent corn, and it was for the purpose of livestock feed. It wasn't the same lovely sweet corn that we get in our markets now. This is corn that would dry out for the purpose of preserving it in the corn cribs as winter feed for all the livestock and the poultry and so forth. So once it actually started turning color, based on my understanding, it lost a lot of its moisture, and that would have made it fairly difficult to eat. Now, granted, we know that there were problems with the armies, especially the Confederate Army, with plagued with diarrhea during that campaign, no doubt. But I'm not trying to take an argument to say it wasn't the corn, because again, if we were only eating green corn and nothing else, I don't know how my digestive tract would hold up. I think there would be problems. So it really depended on whether they were getting a mix of other things, which I doubt. So if that's all they were eating, that might explain it. But I don't believe, since the civilians wrote of eating green corn as kind of like that was part of their subsistence, I don't think that it was considered to be unhealthy per se, based on my understanding.
That's really interesting, because I do feel like I've heard that about the Confederate soldiers eating the green corn and getting diarrhea. So that's fascinating to me that civilians living in the area are just writing about that as like part of their ordinary diet, the day-to-day. And it shows just the level of research that you've done.
I should just, for anybody interested too, I'll jump in and say that there were a lot of interesting testimonies that I was able to cross-reference with regimental. I read a lot of regimental histories for this project as well. And once that field corn would dry out, the soldiers were still very innovative, and many of you probably already know this, but they would take anything from anything from like wooden crates or canteens that had gone bad, that had busted apart during the battle, and they would use that to actually scrape the corn into meal. And there were a lot of accounts. So even though it had dried out, it had lost its moisture, they were finding ways to still use it and grate it. And then they'd add, any sort of, maybe some lard or butter or whatever to it and fry it up and cook it that way. They were so desperate for food, they were doing all kinds of measures. And that's one thing that I do mention in this book. This is definitely not a civilians versus soldiers type of story. I go into a lot of detail about how undersupplied all those poor troops were in both armies, and they really had no choice but to descend on all these properties for food. And it's going against all these orders that were issued by the Federal and Confederate armies. They weren't supposed to be doing that, but they were so hungry that they were disobeying orders to look for food. It was just a terrible time for everyone.
And going back to the claims, Larry has asked, was there a date where claims were no longer accepted?
Yes, actually, there was a law that was passed, and I have the act that I actually included in my book, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. I think it might have been called the Crawford Amendment, but it actually passed around 1915. So when the U.S. Treasury paid those final settlements that I reviewed to those Sharpsburg claimants, it was around that time that Congress passed the Crawford Amendment. I'm pretty sure that's what it was called, which basically prohibited all claims related to the Civil War from being heard by the U.S. Court of Claims. They had just been inundated for half a century, and the government was just ready to move on at that point.
Well, that makes sense. And one comment about your beard, Donna says that if you had been a combatant at Antietam, your lush beard would have been some target.
It would have got me into trouble. I actually, when I was looking through the Library of Congress images and stuff, I came across an old post-war image of Jubal Early, and he had the bald head and the long beard and everything. I thought, I guess if I look like anybody, it might be him. I don't know, but who said, if I put a hat on, maybe I'd look like somebody else. Who knows?
Well, I feel like at least a few years ago, it seems like the beards really did come back. In fact, we've got a T-shirt in the shop that has the beards of all the different generals.
That's great.
Well, we are almost out of time, but I'll ask you one last question. In all your research, because it sounds like you did so much research, I'm sure it all couldn't fit in the book. So is there one thing that you wish you had been able to include in the book?
Yes. Fantastic question. And I did look for it, and I think it might be out there somewhere. I just don't know where, but I really wanted to be able to bring in lots of detail about the Confederate appropriations of property during their stay at Sharpsburg from September 15th through the 18th. I could not find it. Part of that reason is because the U.S. government didn't allow Confederate damages or losses to be included in those claims, so the civilians couldn't list them. That's why a lot of them, but some of them did go off script time and time, and they would refer to the horses that the Confederates took, or the tons of flour that was carried off from grist mills, because the Confederates came through Sharpsburg during the Gettysburg and Monocacy campaigns as well. A lot of people don't know that, and they took tons of property during that time as well. I had to go through the claims and separate all those losses from 1863 and 1864. But I contacted, someone can correct me with the name. I don't want to confuse it. There's a proper name for it, but I just referred to it as the Museum of the Confederacy. But they have records of Confederate quartermasters that I believe Kent Masterson Brown accessed for his study from the retreat from Gettysburg. Great detail listed in those. But when I contacted the museum, they had interestingly told me that same information from Antietam was strangely missing. It just wasn't there. So I don't know where those records, because the Confederates, as I found in my research, they were really good bureaucrats. They gave out receipts if they took your stuff, whereas the Federals were the opposite. I mean, I went through all these returns from the third auditor of the Treasury, and you just couldn't find it from the Army of the Potomac. But it was damning to the civilians if the Confederates gave you a receipt, because that was in the Confederate archives, and the U.S. assistant attorneys would pull that and use it against you in your congressional cases. You were disloyal. You sold corn to the Confederate Army. But I wish that I would have had more data to work with, because I think that would have given me a better collective idea of how the community suffered, because we just don't know how many fence rails or tons of hay and bushels of corn and wheat and horses that the Confederates took from these people at the time of the battle, or during the Gettysburg and Monocacy campaigns. It was bad. It was really bad.
Well, thank you so much for all this fascinating information. And don't forget to purchase the book, all of you who are out there, so that you can learn more about this. It is always great to have so many of you joining us, and especially grateful to you, Steve, for being our guest author and sharing all of the research that you've done over the past 15, 18 years. So I will sign us off now, but I do want to thank you all for attending, and also say a special thank you to our members and donors who are out there. It is through your support that we continue to operate as a museum and to provide all sorts of programs. And if you're not a member, think about becoming a member, and you can find more information about membership and about the American Civil War Museum by visiting our website at acwm.org. So thank you all and have a good night. And again, thank you, Steve, so much. That was excellent.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you everyone again for taking the time to watch. I really appreciate your time.